bank statement sat in a folder marked simply MISC. The fourth folder Nathaniel Ross had opened that afternoon while sorting through his father's financial records. 3 months after Desmond Ross had died of a stroke at 79, Nathaniel had expected the estate to be straightforward. His father had always been careful with money, methodical in the particular way of a man who had grown up without much of it and had spent the rest of his life making sure that scarcity never returned. A modest but consistent earner across 4 decades as a building inspector, a man who drove the same reliable sedan for 11 years past, when most people would have replaced it, who had never once, in Nathaniel's entire memory, taken a vacation that involved an airplane. What Nathaniel had not expected was the recurring monthly payment that appeared, without variation, across 22 years of bank statements, a fixed transfer, adjusted upward every few years by a modest amount, to a property management company Nathaniel had never heard of, for an address he did not recognize as belonging to any member of his family. He sat at his father's desk with the statement spread in front of him, doing the arithmetic slowly, understanding with growing unease that his father had been paying rent consistently for over 2 decades on an apartment that no one in the family had ever lived in, ever visited, or, as far as Nathaniel could determine, from every conversation he could remember across his entire adult life, ever once mentioned. He drove to the address that same afternoon, telling himself he was simply confirming a clerical oddity, some vestigial account his father had forgotten to close, though some quieter part of him understood, even as he drove, that a man as careful as Desmond Ross did not accidentally continue paying rent for 22 years on a property nobody used. The building was a modest, well-maintained complex on the other side of the city. Nothing remarkable. The kind of place Nathaniel might have driven past 1,000 times without noticing. He stood outside the building for a while before making himself go in, and when he finally knocked on the unit listed in his father's records, a woman in her late 50s answered, steady-eyed, careful in her movements, in a way that suggested some old, permanent physical limitation, occupying the apartment with the settled comfort of someone who had lived there a very long time. "Can I help you?" she asked. That evening, back at his father's house, going through the same desk more thoroughly, he found a small locked drawer he had initially assumed contained nothing more significant than old tax documents. Inside, beneath a stack of unrelated papers, was a single yellowed newspaper clipping, folded and refolded so many times its creases had gone soft. The headline, dated 35 years earlier, read, "Local woman, 19, seriously injured in collision. Driver cited for failure to yield." The driver's name, printed in the 3rd paragraph, was Desmond Ross. The injured woman's name, printed 2 lines below it, was the same name Nathaniel had just seen, an hour earlier, on his father's 22 years of quiet, unexplained rent payments. Nathaniel Ross was 46 years old, a building inspector for the city, married for 19 years to a patient, grounded woman named Carol, father to a 16-year-old daughter, Grace, who had inherited, Nathaniel sometimes thought, more of her grandfather's careful watchfulness than either of her actual parents' more expressive temperaments. He had grown up believing he understood his father completely, not every biographical fact, necessarily, but the essential shape of the man, steady, unshowy, generous in practical rather than dramatic ways, a father who had never once, across Nathaniel's entire childhood, raised his voice, who had shown love primarily through reliability rather than declaration, arriving at every school event, every game, every ordinary Tuesday dinner, without fail, for as long as Nathaniel could remember. Desmond's frugality had always struck the family as simple temperament, rather than anything requiring explanation. He earned a comfortable, if unremarkable, salary across his career, and yet the family had lived, by choice it seemed, considerably below what that salary might reasonably have supported. A modest house, purchased early and never upgraded, the same reliable but unglamorous vehicles, driven well past their expected lifespan, family vacations that rarely extended beyond a few hours' drive. Nathaniel's mother, Marguerite, 76 now, and still deep in the early disorienting months of her own grief, had always attributed this frugality to Desmond's own upbringing, the son of parents who had come through genuine hardship, who had raised him with a particular, ingrained caution around money that had simply become part of who he was. Marguerite had handled the household's day-to-day spending throughout the marriage, but Desmond had always managed the larger financial architecture, the retirement accounts, the mortgage, the long-term savings, with a specific, careful attention that Marguerite had never once had reason to question. Nathaniel remembered, from somewhere in his childhood, a scar on his father's forearm, a faded, thin line that Desmond had mentioned exactly once in passing when Nathaniel had asked about it as a young boy. Car accident, his father had said, with a brief, closed expression that had discouraged further questions. A long time ago, before your mother. Nothing worth talking about. Nathaniel had absorbed this the way children absorb most closed subjects in a family, as simply one of the unremarkable, unexplained facts of a parent's distant past, not requiring any further curiosity. He had never once connected that scar, in 38 years of occasionally noticing it, to anything beyond the vague, dismissive explanation his father had offered when Nathaniel was perhaps 8 years old. Nathaniel's own present life carried its own quiet, unexamined avoidance. His daughter Grace had been struggling for the better part of a year with a specific anxiety around her upcoming college applications, a pressure Nathaniel recognized uncomfortably as connected to his own occasional, offhand comments about the cost of tuition, comments he had made without fully realizing how much weight Grace had apparently been carrying as a result. Carol had gently suggested, more than once, that Nathaniel needed to sit down with Grace directly and have an honest conversation about the family's actual finances and expectations, rather than letting Grace continue to construct her own anxious, unspoken assumptions about what the family could or couldn't afford. Nathaniel had agreed, each time, that he would have the conversation soon. He had not yet had it, telling himself, each time the opportunity arose, that the timing wasn't quite right, that Grace had enough on her mind already, that the conversation could wait until after the immediate stress of applications had passed. He had not yet recognized, standing in his father's study with a newspaper clipping in his hands, exactly how directly his own quiet postponements were about to be confronted by the full, unexpected shape of what happens when careful, well-intentioned silence is allowed to stretch across decades instead of years. Nathaniel spent the following several days researching the accident through old newspaper archives and, eventually, through a former colleague who still had contacts at the county courthouse, piecing together a fuller picture of what had happened on a spring afternoon 35 years earlier. Desmond Ross, 22 years old at the time, had been driving through an intersection during a momentary lapse of attention, distracted, according to the accident report, by a road sign he'd been trying to read, failing to yield at a stop that had, until recently, not required a full stop at all under the intersection's previous configuration. He had struck a car driven by a 19-year-old woman named Vivian Castor, who had been thrown against the interior of her vehicle with enough force to cause a spinal injury that left her, according to the medical records Nathaniel eventually located through the court file, with permanent mobility limitations and chronic pain that would follow her for the remainder of her life. And Vivian? Nathaniel learned from a follow-up newspaper article published several months after the accident, had been, at the time, a promising young dancer, months away from an audition with a respected regional company, a future that the accident had ended entirely, replacing it with years of surgeries, physical therapy, and a slow, difficult rebuilding of a life reoriented around limitations she had not been born with and had not chosen. Desmond had been found substantially at fault. The insurance settlement, Nathaniel discovered through the same court records, had been modest by the standards of the injury itself, sufficient to cover Vivian's immediate medical costs, but falling considerably short of what her lost earning potential, her lost dream, might reasonably have been valued at under different legal circumstances. Nathaniel sat with this information for several days before he could make himself return to Vivian's apartment, understanding, with a growing and uncomfortable clarity, exactly what his father's 22 years of quiet, unexplained rent payments had actually represented. Not an accidental oversight, not a forgotten account, but a private, sustained act of amends that Desmond had apparently carried, silently, for the majority of his adult life, never once mentioning it to his wife, his son, or, as far as Nathaniel could determine, anyone else at all. He told Carol everything on the fourth evening, sitting together at their kitchen table long after Grace had gone to bed. Carol listened without interrupting, her expression moving slowly through shock and then something more complicated, more tender, as she absorbed the full shape of what Nathaniel was describing. "He never told your mother," Carol said, once Nathaniel had finished. 22 years, and he never once told the person he was married to. "I don't think he told anyone," Nathaniel said, his voice unsteady. "I think he just decided, at some point, that this was his to carry alone, and he carried it, every month, for over 2 decades, adjusting the payment as her rent increased, making sure she always had somewhere stable to live, and never once let any of us know any of it was happening." "How are you going to handle it?" Carol asked gently. Nathaniel looked at the newspaper clipping, still sitting on the table between them, his father's name printed in a 35-year-old article Nathaniel had never once, in his entire life, known existed. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "I don't know if telling her the truth helps her, or just disrupts a life she's apparently already rebuilt without needing to know who was behind it. I don't know if telling my mother helps her grieve more completely, or just adds an enormous, painful complication to a loss she's already struggling with." He paused, recognizing something in his own hesitation even as he articulated it. "I think I might be doing the thing I always do, deciding, on my own, what other people can handle, instead of trusting them enough to just tell them the truth and let them handle it themselves." Nathaniel did not tell his mother for nearly 3 weeks. He told himself, during those weeks, that he was simply waiting for the right moment, a private, unhurried opportunity that would allow Marguerite to absorb something this significant without the added strain of an ordinary busy day disrupting her ability to process it fully. This explanation held up, in his own estimation, for perhaps the first week. After that, he recognized, with a discomfort that had become increasingly familiar over the preceding month, that he was doing precisely what he suspected his father had done for 22 years, deciding, quietly and unilaterally, that certain truths were his alone to manage, rather than trusting the people he loved enough to let them carry difficult information alongside him. He returned to research the accident more thoroughly during those weeks, reading through additional court documents, understanding more fully the specific shape of what Vivian Castor had lost that spring afternoon. Not simply a dance career, though that loss alone would have been enormous, but years of surgeries, a body that required ongoing, expensive accommodation, a life reoriented entirely around limitations that had arrived, without warning, on an ordinary drive to an ordinary rehearsal. He found, buried deeper in his father's financial records, evidence of a specific, careful attentiveness that went beyond simply maintaining a fixed monthly payment. Desmond had adjusted the amount not just for rent increases, but, on several occasions across the 22 years, for what appeared to be additional accommodation costs, a modification to the apartment's bathroom, a specific increase timed to what Nathaniel eventually confirmed through the property management company, coincided with an accessibility renovation to the unit's entryway. His father, Nathaniel understood with growing and complicated grief, had not simply set up an anonymous payment and forgotten about it for 2 decades. He had apparently continued paying attention, quietly, from a distance, to the specific and evolving needs of a woman he had injured 35 years earlier, adjusting his support as her circumstances changed, without ever once revealing himself, without ever once, as far as Nathaniel could determine, seeking any acknowledgement or forgiveness in return. Carol noticed Nathaniel's growing preoccupation during those weeks, the late evenings spent in his father's old study, the the specific quality of distraction that had begun creeping into his interactions with Grace, who had asked him twice, with visible hurt, why he seemed to be somewhere else, even when he was technically in the room with her. "You're doing it with Grace too," Carol told him gently, one evening, after Grace had gone upstairs following an unusually quiet dinner. "The same thing you're worried your father did. You still haven't had the conversation about college costs, and now you're disappearing into this other secret, and I think she can feel both of those absences even if she can't fully name what they are." Nathaniel absorbed this observation with the specific discomfort of hearing an accurate thing said plainly. "I know," he admitted. "I keep telling myself I'll do it once this other thing settles. I think that's exactly the trap. I think there's always going to be some reason the timing isn't quite right unless I just decide to stop waiting for the timing to feel perfect." He had the conversation with Grace that same week, not perfectly, not without some initial awkwardness on both sides, but honestly laying out the family's actual financial situation, the actual scope of what was possible and what would require careful planning, releasing his daughter from months of anxious, unspoken assumptions she had apparently been quietly carrying entirely alone. "Why didn't you just tell me sooner?" Grace asked, once the numbers had been laid plainly on the table between them, her relief evident even through a lingering frustration. "I think I was scared of disappointing you," Nathaniel admitted. "I think I told myself I was protecting you from worrying, but I think I was actually just protecting myself from having to see your face if the answer wasn't what you were hoping for." Grace was quiet for a moment. "I'd rather know," she said finally, "even if it's hard. Not knowing was worse." Nathaniel thought about his father's 22 years of silent, careful payments and understood, with a clarity that had been building for weeks, exactly what he needed to do next. Nathaniel told his mother everything on a Sunday afternoon, sitting together in the small kitchen where Marguerite had cooked dinner for her family for over 4 decades. He had rehearsed the conversation many times in the preceding days and found, once the actual moment arrived, that none of his rehearsed versions felt adequate to the size of what he needed to say. He simply told her plainly the bank statements, the apartment, the newspaper clipping, the accident that had happened 3 years before Desmond and Marguerite had even met. Marguerite was quiet for a long time after Nathaniel finished, her hands folded on the table, her expression moving through several things Nathaniel found difficult to fully read. "I always knew there was something," she said finally, her voice careful. "Not what exactly, but something. He was careful about money in a way that never quite made sense to me, given what he actually earned. I asked him about it once years ago, why we lived so far below what I knew he was bringing home. He told me he liked the security of having more saved than we needed. I believed him because it seemed like a reasonable enough answer, and because I trusted him completely, and because pushing further felt, at the time, like questioning something that wasn't really my business to question." "Are you angry?" Nathaniel asked quietly. "That he never told you?" Marguerite considered this seriously, the question deserving more than a reflexive answer. "I think I might be a little," she said slowly. "Not about the accident itself. That happened before I ever knew him, and I don't think either of us can hold a 22-year-old responsible for something that happened when he was younger and less careful than the man I actually married. But I think I'm angry that he carried something this large for our entire marriage and never once let me share the weight of it with him. I think I would have wanted to know. I think knowing would have changed how I understood some of his quieter moods over the years, moments when he seemed distant or troubled that I always attributed to work stress. And now I wonder if some of those moments were actually about her." "I don't know how to feel about it either," Nathaniel admitted. "I keep going back and forth between being proud of him for carrying this kind of quiet responsibility for over 2 decades, never asking for credit, never trying to ease his own guilt at her expense, and being hurt that he never trusted any of us enough to let us know. I think both of those feelings can be true at the same time," Marguerite said. I think that's probably going to be true of most of what we learn about him now going forward. I don't think grief works cleanly. I don't think it's ever just one feeling at a time. Nathaniel returned to Vivian Castor's apartment the following week, this time with a newspaper clipping in hand, understanding that whatever came next needed to be delivered honestly and directly, rather than continuing the pattern of careful, protective omission that had apparently shaped his father's entire relationship with this particular truth. Vivian answered the door with the same steady, careful composure Nathaniel remembered from his first visit, though something in her expression shifted, subtly, seeing him return a second time. "I thought you might come back," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "I've been wondering, since your first visit, whether there was more to why you were asking questions about my rent." They sat together in her small, comfortably furnished living room, and Nathaniel, after a long moment of hesitation, handed her the newspaper clipping. Vivian read it slowly, her expression shifting through several stages Nathaniel found difficult to fully follow. Recognition, then something that looked like old, carefully managed grief resurfacing, and finally, a specific stillness that seemed to settle over her as she absorbed the full implication of what Nathaniel was telling her. "He's been paying my rent," she said finally, her voice quiet, "for 22 years, the man who caused the accident." "I found the records after he died," Nathaniel said. "I didn't know any of this until 3 weeks ago. I don't think anyone in my family knew. He never told my mother. He never told me. I think he decided, a long time ago, that this was his to carry entirely alone." Vivian was quiet for a long moment, looking at the article in her hands. "I always wondered," she said finally, "about the fund. The property management company told me, years ago, that my rent was being covered by a private benefactor who wished to remain anonymous. Some kind of personal charitable arrangement, they said, connected loosely to a disability assistance program. Though I could never get much more detail than that. I used to imagine sometimes that it might be him, the driver. I don't know why I thought that exactly. Some instinct, maybe, or just the specific shape of the timing. Since the payment started not long after the settlement money ran out, I'd let myself imagine it, and then I'd talk myself out of it, because it seemed like too painful a thing to hope for and be wrong about." "You were right," Nathaniel said quietly. Vivian's eyes filled unexpectedly, and she sat with the information for a long moment before speaking again. "I don't know exactly what I feel," she admitted. "Part of me is angry, I think, that he never had the courage to tell me directly, to actually apologize to my face instead of just sending money through an anonymous channel for over 2 decades. But another part of me understands, or is trying to understand, that showing up directly might have felt, to him, like asking for something from me. Forgiveness, absolution, some kind of resolution. And maybe he didn't feel entitled to ask for that. Maybe the anonymity was the only way he could give without it becoming, in some way, about his own need to feel better." "That sounds like him," Nathaniel said. "He was never comfortable being thanked for anything. I think if you'd known who he was, he would have felt like the gift stopped being a gift and started being a transaction." Vivian looked at the article again, at the young man's name printed in a 35-year-old newspaper. "I'd built a whole life after that accident," she said slowly. "It wasn't the life I'd planned. I never danced professionally, not the way I'd hoped to, but I became a counselor. Eventually, I work with young people navigating sudden disability, helping them find their way toward whatever the next version of their life looks like, when the version they'd planned isn't available to them anymore. I've helped a lot of people find that. I never fully understood how much of my own ability to do that work came from having landed, somehow, in stable housing during the hardest years of my recovery, without ever having to worry about where I'd live while I rebuilt everything else." "I don't think he knew that," Nathaniel said. "About your work, I don't think he ever tried to find out more than he needed to know to keep helping." "Maybe that was its own kind of respect," Vivian said quietly. "Not intruding on the life I was building, just making sure the floor stayed solid under it, without ever needing to know what I built on top." Nathaniel and Vivian met several more times over the following months, the relationship settling, slowly and without any particular urgency, into something that felt less like an obligation inherited from his father and more like an actual evolving friendship built on its own honest footing. He asked her, during one visit, whether she wanted him to continue the payments his father had maintained for over 2 decades, understanding that the decision needed to be entirely hers, rather than something he decided on her behalf out of his own need to feel he was honoring his father's memory correctly. Vivian considered the question seriously. "I don't need the payments anymore, actually," she said. "My work is stable now, has been for a long time. I think, if I'm honest, I kept the arrangement going less out of financial necessity in recent years, and more because it had become a strange, invisible thread connecting me to whoever was on the other end of it, even without knowing who that was. Now that I know, I think what I actually want isn't the money. I think I want this." She gestured between them. "An actual relationship, instead of an anonymous one. I'd rather have you visit because you want to be here than have a payment arrive each month from a source I never got to properly know." Nathaniel felt something loosen in his chest, a specific relief he hadn't expected, the understanding that honoring his father's memory did not require simply continuing the same silent, distant arrangement indefinitely, but might instead mean building something more honest and more present in its place. He told his mother about this conversation, and Marguerite, after some consideration, asked whether she might come along on his next visit, a request that surprised Nathaniel, though he understood, watching his mother's careful, deliberate courage in making it, that she was choosing, in her own way, the same thing Nathaniel had chosen weeks earlier with Grace, to face a difficult truth directly, rather than continuing to hold it at a protective, unexamined distance. The visit, when it happened, was quiet and considerably less dramatic than Nathaniel had anticipated. 2 women, connected by a man neither of them had fully known in the same way, sitting together in a small living room, speaking carefully and honestly about grief, about guilt, about the specific, complicated grace of an amends that had never once asked to be forgiven. "I think I understand him better now," Marguerite said near the end of that visit, "than I did in 40 years of marriage. I think that's a strange thing to say about someone I loved completely, but I think this," she gestured at the room, at Vivian, at the entire slow unfolding of the preceding months, "this shows me a part of him I never had access to before. A man who carried an enormous weight for over 2 decades and never once let it turn him bitter or defensive. I think, if anything, it makes me love him more completely, even though it also makes me wish so much that he'd trusted me enough to carry some of it alongside him." On a clear afternoon the following spring, nearly a year after Desmond's death, Nathaniel sat with Vivian in her small living room, the 2 of them now meeting regularly, the relationship having settled into something neither anonymous nor purely transactional, an actual ongoing friendship built slowly across the wreckage of a decades-old accident and the careful, complicated amends that had followed it. "I've been thinking about something," Vivian said during that visit. "I'd like to plant something at the accident site if it's still recognizable, or somewhere else meaningful if it isn't. Not as a memorial to what happened, more as a marker of everything that came after, the life I built, the life he apparently spent decades quietly supporting from a distance. I think I'd like you and your mother to be there, if you're willing." They found the intersection 3 weeks later, reconfigured decades earlier with the full stop signal that had been absent at the time of the accident, unremarkable now, indistinguishable from countless other intersections in the city. Nathaniel, Marguerite, and Vivian stood together at the corner, and Vivian, with some difficulty but firm determination, knelt to plant a small dogwood sapling in the narrow strip of grass beside the sidewalk, the 3 of them taking turns pressing the soil firm around its base. "I don't think this fixes anything," Vivian said, standing again, brushing dirt from her hands. "I don't think a tree undoes an accident, or 22 years of silence, or a dance career that never happened. I don't think that's really the point of planting it. What is the point then? Nathaniel asked. Vivian considered the question for a long moment, looking at the small tree, its branches still bare in the early spring cold. I think it's just proof, she said finally, that something kept growing anyway, despite everything that happened here, despite 35 years of silence on his part, and grief on mine, and this whole tangled, complicated inheritance the two of you have had to sort through since he died. I think that's worth marking, not the accident, the growing that happened after it, even when nobody was watching closely enough to notice. Nathaniel drove home from the intersection that afternoon, his mother beside him in the passenger seat, both of them quiet for most of the drive, the specific, settled quiet of two people who have finally finished carrying something they'd been holding, separately and silently, for longer than either of them had needed to. I'm going to tell Grace the rest of it, he said, eventually, breaking the silence. Not just the college money conversation, the whole story, her grandfather, the accident, Vivian, all of it. I think she's old enough to understand what it actually means to carry something quietly for decades instead of just saying the hard thing out loud when it happens. What do you hope she takes from it? Marguerite asked. Nathaniel considered this carefully, watching the road ahead, thinking about a small dogwood sapling now standing at an ordinary intersection that had once, 35 years earlier, changed the entire trajectory of a stranger's life. I hope she understands that you can spend your whole life trying to make something right, quietly, without ever getting credit for it, and that still matters, he said slowly. But I also hope she understands that the quiet part isn't actually required, that you can make something right and still let the people who love you carry some of the weight alongside you. I don't think those two things have to be separate. I think my father believed, for some reason, that they did. I'd like her to grow up believing something a little more generous than that. Marguerite reached over and took her son's hand, the gesture quiet and unhurried, the two of them driving home together to an ordinary spring afternoon, carrying, finally, not a secret, but simply a story, complicated, imperfect, and no longer entirely hidden in a locked drawer, waiting to be found.